All right, well, let's get started. So here's what I guess the plan for today. I'm going to talk a little bit about deontological approaches, and it's going to be probably necessarily a little bit painfully brief, but I'm going to do my best. And then we're going to look at at least to my mind, rather controversial article about torture. And we're going to have kind of a small group discussion about it. And then what we want to do is we want to kind of simulate the ethics bowl. So what we're, instead of analyzing it using the stakeholders, the facts and the interests and the values, the way we've been doing that, we're going to try to get into groups to actually construct an argument. Then after that, we're going to actually have two teams and actually get the teams to present the position and the response, and then have discussion about how it went. And in this case, we're really encouraging high school students, if they are willing to step up and give a shot at doing a kind of an ad hoc ethics bowl trial run. So we're going to do that, and then I'm very, very happy to say my colleague Bob Gillis is going to talk a little bit about Walzer and Dirty Hands, and since torture is one of the things that Walzer discusses, he's going to say a little bit about how Walzer's article and views inform or can inform the discussion. So that's the plan for today. So let's go back 2 weeks. If you remember 2 weeks ago, we talked about consequentialism, and I gave this slide, but it's worth bringing it up again because of the obvious contrast. So as we talked about last workshop, consequentialism, it's a moral theory that says that actions, policies, institutions, they're right or wrong depending on the consequences. And one way you can break it down is you can say every consequentialist theory has two components. First of all, it defines something that is good or some things that are good. And then it says you ought to promote the good, and that can go different ways. But the idea of a consequentialist theory is the ethical thing to do is to bring about good consequences. And this is one of the dominant moral theories, possibly the dominant moral theory. But we're not talking about that today. We're talking about deontology. I thought maybe I'd just put it to the group. So if you're a consequentialist, at least if you're a pure consequentialist, you're going to say consequences are all that matter when trying to decide if something is right or wrong, good or bad, so on and so forth. So if you want to decide if it's the right action, or if it's a policy we ought to endorse, or an institution we ought to support, or maybe try to change, consequentialists will say, well, we have to look at the consequences of that action, policy, institution. Let me just ask the group. A lot of people find this view that consequences are all that matters a little bit problematic. Can anybody think of any examples where you might think, something is right or wrong, irrespective of the consequences? Yeah. Torture, yeah. So kind of an obvious one. It's Britain, right?
Brigida.
Brigida? Brigida. Yeah. Anything else? Yeah.
Removing someone else's rationality.
Yeah, I don't think the consequences would be that great either, but yeah.
I mean, there might be good reasons why you might want to with some people.
Yeah. No, I think that's probably right. So you think maybe brainwashing or
I was thinking like what they used to do, split the frontal lobe or something.
Involuntary lobotomy.
Yes.
Yeah.
I think that's always wrong.
Yeah. That is,
War, just or unjust.
yeah. Yeah. You might think the decision to go to war shouldn't just be a matter of evaluating consequences. Maybe you might think there's something. Why don't you tell me a little bit more about what you're thinking?
Well, from a pacifist point of view, that Walzer rejects whether or not that pacifist point of view is correct.
Yeah. Yeah. You might think it's looking at the consequences is the wrong way to have the discussion. Yeah. Killing. All killing or somehow? Yeah. No, absolutely. Yeah.
Punishment.
All punishment?
All punishment.
All right, so we have a lot of sort of strong deontologists. This is good because, you know, consequentialism sounds very plausible when you first present it. But when you start thinking about it, you quickly run into cases where it just doesn't seem that easy. It's not just a matter of academic consequences. Some things, a lot of people think, just ought to be taken off the table. So, if you think the consequences aren't all that matters, you might be a deontologist. All right, so let me just give you kind of just a quick outline. This is how John Rawls' theory of justice made a distinction. And it's an influential way of making it. It's not the only way, and I don't think it's entirely unproblematic. But you know, Rawls defined the difference in this way. So consequentialists believe the good is more fundamental, and the right is defined in terms of the good. So if you're a consequentialist, you want to know what right is, you have to know whether it promotes the good. It's the good that's primary, the right is defined in terms of the good. Now the ontologists, they think the right is more fundamental than the good. Another way of putting this, consequentialists hold that the ends justify the means. So killing, it's good or bad, depending on what comes out of it. A lot of the ontologists would say, look, no, killing's wrong. We don't need to ask about the consequences. We know that. And that's how we should think about ethics. So deontologists, they reject this. They think that immoral means, this is the big question, which are immoral means, are not justified even for a good end. Are you guys comfortable with this basic distinction, consequentialism versus deontology?
Yes.
Okay. So I'm going to give you two deontological approaches in way less time than I should be allowed to do this. I feel a little bit dishonest doing this, but I'm going to do my best. And I debated long and hard whether I should talk about Kant. And I finally said, well, I weighed the consequences. I decided that the harm of not discussing Kant would be graver than the harm that might come out of my discussing Kant. And I'll give it as a way of, as a remedy to any inadequacy in my presentation. I encourage you sometime in your life to read Kant himself. Just make sure you have a block of at least 2 years or so.
Yeah.
I spent 2 years of my life doing that, and that was wow. All right, so this is Kant light. Kant in 3 slides. So I want to just take some basic insights from Kant that I think are actually quite important. And one of the most famous lines from probably the most famous work in ethics, the groundwork for the metaphysics of morals, is that nothing can possibly be conceived in the world, or even out of it, which can be good, called good without qualification, except for a goodwill. And I think this is a little bit similar to what Mark was saying a moment ago. Kant was very, very conscious of how little control we have over the environment. So you can have the best intentions and act in certain ways, but something can always go wrong. And anything in this world, the phenomenal world, Kant's terminology, it can turn out to be flawed in different ways or not turn out in different ways. But in the goodwill, if you really do things, the right sort of intentions, you can't corrupt that. That in some ways is apart from the actual consequences of your action. So he captures an insight that a lot of us have in ethics, which is that ethics is, well, intention is really important for ethics. So, why you do things makes a major difference in whether it's right or wrong. So, I don't know, if, dumb example, if I trip and fall down the stairs and happen to bump into a senior citizen on the stairs and knock the person over and she breaks her hip. That's terrible, right? But, you're not going to say, Alex, you're an evil person because you tripped and fell, unless I'm somehow responsible for my tripping and falling through negligence or whatever. there's a case this is actually the philosopher Schopenhauer I remember reading about years ago, where I guess he pushed his landlady downstairs. Kind of an awful case. You know, we think in that case Schopenhauer was at least in that case, not a very good person. So, I mean, kind of the basic point is that, you know, intention is really essential to judging the morality of actions. And Kant went a little bit further. He said, you know, a good will is the only thing that can be good in itself. So then this is one common insight. The other insight that I think will actually be a lot of use to ethic bowlers comes from what is called the second formulation of the categorical imperative. And, you know, we have time, we go into some detail about what a categorical imperative is and why Kant thought that ethics has to be based on the categorical imperative. I'm just going to tell you he has at least 3 formulations of the categorical imperative. And depending on who you ask in the Kant literature, I've seen anything from 3 to 6, 7, 4 formulations. But the second one I think is actually really useful, and I think it captures another intuition that a lot of us should keep in mind. So the second formulation is, so act that you treat humanity, whether your own person or the person of any other, always at the same time as an end, never merely as a means. Well, that's some kind of mysterious, as I put it here, but I think there's a way of explaining it that actually can be quite useful. And it has to do, for Kant, with our nature as persons. And what Kant thought was essential to our nature is that we're rational and that we're free. And there's something different in Kant's mind about human beings than, well, non-human animals and other things, which as free, rational beings, we're able to set ends for ourselves. We have goals, plans. We have ways that we define ourselves in our lives. And we choose our ends. And Kant thought that was a fundamental part of being a free being. And his ethics really is based around freedom. And he thought this rational free nature deserves respect. So this capacity we have to set ends for ourselves, we can actually rationally decide this is what I want to do or this is what I want to be, and then we're capable of freely pursuing them. This insight is, I think, kind of a fundamental one in our culture. Because sort of as a default, we tend to think that you should respect people unless you have a darn good reason not to do so. So in a lot of ways, Kant's insight is related to the liberal tradition and thought. This comes up often in the ethics bowl. We talked, the PSU students and I talked this morning about the Heart Attack Grill, this truly awful restaurant in Las Vegas. But you know, in that particular case, you might apply one Kant insight, which is, you know, if you're going to prevent people from eating 12,000 calories in a single setting, you have to be pretty sure you're ready to override people's autonomy. You know, Kant said that people were autonomous, they're laws unto themselves. And, you know, at least as a first stance, you know, the standard is you respect people's ends that they've set for themselves freely, and then if you really want to say that you shouldn't respect them, it's your job to show that you have a strong case to say that it's not. So I think these two parts of Kant can be really useful for ethics bowlers. I think it comes up again and again in cases, you know, questions about freedom. And to what extent ought you have to have, say, government regulation, or ought you to take some sort of measures that prevent people from doing things they choose to. Kant sets the standard pretty high in when you can do that. All right, I want to move on to the next bit. This is another possibly deontological approach, which has to do with rights. And I've found in analyzing cases in the ethics bowl that rights often come up fairly naturally as a major component in trying to figure out what a case is. And the nice thing about rights is they're integrated into our culture and also into our legal traditions. So, we have things like we have the US Constitution or the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which, these are legal documents, but at least many parts of them also express what a lot of people consider to be moral rights, and they're relatively uncontroversial moral rights. I say relatively because these are long documents, and there are parts that certainly are controversial. So, one approach I think we often find ourselves saying is, the way of analyzing a case study often turns around some right. Some examples: right to life, liberty, security of person, privacy, freedom from slavery, freedom of thought and expression, right to political participation, property. There's obviously controversy about how these are interpreted, but there's a broad consensus that these are rights. They ought to be respected in some way, and often you can develop an account of how you want to understand a case by developing, one of these rights. So, I just wanted to say a little bit about human rights. And one book I found helpful in the past is James Nichols' Basics of Human Rights. It's second edition now, and I think it's clear. It's not entirely uncontroversial, but he's a widely respected author. And I poached this from Nichols and simplified it a little bit. Because often, we tend to think of human rights as basic moral rights. And one suggestion is, what makes something a human right? How can you say it's a human right? And one criteria Nichols gives is, these four criteria. So the first idea is that human rights are rights that we possess simply by being human. They're not rights you possess by being an American. They're not rights that you possess by being a member of a certain community, being gender or social class or so on and so forth. Human beings all have these rights because they're humans. And the second point, and this is kind of a major one, they're moral rights. So human rights aren't simply rights that you get because people pass laws. Rather, they're basic moral rights that can be used to criticize governments and other people. And not only are they moral rights, but they're basic rights. And one way of putting this is they establish the minimum standards. So human rights tell us what all human beings need and deserve to have. One way of establishing human rights is to talk about fundamental human interests. So some philosophers have argued that the human rights pick out the most fundamental universal human interests. And that's not actually a bad way of explaining why something deserves to be considered a human right. And then the claim is they're universal and they apply across place and time. So I guess in my view, often with ethics goal, you often find that if you can articulate a human right as kind of the center of your discussion, that's a pretty good way of building a moral argument. And if you're asked why it's a human right, you can point out some of these characteristics, especially the moral rights and of basic significance. That's a pretty good way of building up a case. I wanted to just mention one more thing before we do a segue into talking about the article Choice of Evils, which is rights have structure. And again, if we had more time, we could talk in a lot more detail about how legal and moral philosophers have analyzed rights. It can get a bit more complicated than this, but one thing that's interesting about rights is they seem to necessarily entail duties. If I have a right to something, it means that other people have a corresponding duty. Sometimes the corresponding duty is just to leave me alone and let me exercise my right. But often, rights are logically attached to certain duties that others have. And sometimes people talk about positive versus negative rights. I actually think the distinction doesn't work, but that's another case. But some people talk about negative rights where you just have a corresponding duty not to interfere, and positive rights where you actually have a positive duty to do something to help the person fulfill the right. And so if you look at the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, it has a really kind of interesting history where it was put together by the powers that won the Second World War. And there was actually a lot of controversy about negotiating what actually went into it. And one of the controversies has been social rights. rights to shelter, education, things along those lines. And some people have argued, libertarians argue this sometimes, that those aren't real rights because of the obligations put on other people. I actually think that's an oversimplification. I'll tell you why. Take the right we're going to talk about, or the purported right we're going to talk about, freedom from torture. It's pretty clear that if you have a right not to be tortured, people have a negative duty not to torture you. That seems right? But the way this is often expressed as well is that many people think that the right not to torture also imposes obligations on governments. If people have a right not to be tortured, they also have a right to live in a society where the government makes sure that the police, the army, criminal gangs, whoever, aren't doing any torture. And this is actually the Convention Against Torture, Article 2.1. Each state party shall take effective legislative, administrative, judicial, and other measures to prevent acts of torture in any territory under its jurisdiction. And I mean, think about it a second. You can't say, I live in a society that doesn't believe in torture if the government doesn't do anything to actually make sure that that's the case. If it really is a society that believes in upholding these fundamental so-called negative rights, they actually have to take a lot of measures to ensure that people are actually able to enjoy those rights. That goes with life, liberty, freedom of thought, freedom of expression, freedom from torture. Those rights don't just emerge out of the government stepping back and saying, hey, yeah, you guys have these rights. It actually involves creating a society where people have access to that. Yeah.